Russell Wilson will be riding the bench the rest of the way. Broncos willing to take on the dead cap of his contract. They don't even care. They're just like, screw it, we're going to cut him by March. Then that just brings up the questions of what is going to happen in Russell Wilson's future. I mean, he didn't have a bad year. Touchdowns up, interceptions down. The Sean Payton experiment with Russell Wilson, it worked from a statistical point of view. Unfortunately, the win-loss record, I guess, just wasn't good enough. There was some internal strife between Russell Wilson and Sean Payton. We saw that blow up on the sidelines, and now we've landed in this point. So when you think about where Russell Wilson's going to be playing next year, what do you think is a location, a team that you could see him suiting up for?
Okay, so everything that's happened here with Russell Wilson is really interesting because the Broncos have essentially said that we don't have a backup plan, we don't have a contingency plan, but we also don't want Russell Wilson. And you just don't usually see that level of disrespect and being thrown out the door by a player of Russell Wilson's caliber. And granted, he did most of his winning and successes in a potential Hall of Fame career with another team. So maybe that makes it easier at the end. Like when Derek Carr got shown the door by the Raiders, it was like the ultimate disrespect because even as mid as we joke Derek Carr is, he's still the franchise's all-time leader in passing touchdowns and games started and stuff like that. And
I guess my question with that is, do you think that Sean Payton went into the season with an agenda to already have an exit plan on Russell Wilson?
Yes, because if you saw the tweet that was basically like an article from Jordan Schultz, it's like 2,000 words in a tweet. Jordan Schultz put out that on October 29th, after the Broncos beat Kansas City in the Patrick Mahomes flu game, 2 days later on Halloween, the Broncos went to Russell Wilson and said, either you're going to be benched for the season or you're going to remove the injury clause in your contract that says if you get hurt, you get $38 million guaranteed in addition to the $39 million they'll already be paying as a dead cap when they cut him in February, maybe March. And so Russell Wilson was apparently shocked by this, blindsided. He wasn't going to waive the injury deferments. He went to the NFLPA, the Broncos, himself, his representation, and apparently some independent fourth party, and they started working on what recourse they had. And then Russell Wilson kept playing. The Broncos kept winning. They ironically got into the playoff race after being like 3-8 at the time that all of this was going down. They jumped into the playoff race, and then they lost to New England. And as soon as they lost to New England, that's when the Broncos looked up and said, there is no chance we're going to make the playoff. We do not see a future with Russell Wilson, so we're going to just end the relationship right now. Like with Derek Carr last year, I don't see a scenario where Russell Wilson is going to show up next week. They're going to deactivate him. They're going to send him home. He's essentially no longer a Denver Bronco. And as Jordan Schultz talked about, like the relationship was done. When they came to him and said this was a major riff in the relationship. They knew as of October that this thing was done with Russell Wilson. They did not see him as the future. They were not going to go forward with Russell Wilson. So yeah, I think going into the season, Sean Payton had an idea in his mind that they weren't going to have Russell Wilson as the long-term option at quarterback. And frankly, they don't have an alternative option right now. They have just essentially done what Arthur Smith did a few years ago in Atlanta, which was we're going to get rid of Matt Ryan, but we're not going to have a contingency plan for how to replace Matt Ryan. They've just made the conclusion that we are going to get rid of Russell Wilson, and we'll see how it goes for the Broncos. But to answer your original question, yes, I do believe that going into the season, this was premeditated. They were not going to run it back with Russell Wilson.
And you have to think, though, at least this season, Sean Payton definitely built up his coaching equity because I mentioned it. You look at the raw numbers, and Russell Wilson was performing a lot better than he was last year, like night and day between Nathaniel Hackett's offense and Sean Payton's offense. So Sean Payton, he's a made man. He's eating up all that Walmart money right now without a quarterback. That's always a precarious position to find yourself in as a head coach. You mentioned the successes, the unexpected successes that the Broncos have had this year in terms of the win-loss record. I mean, coming off of that 70-point beatdown against the Miami Dolphins, I never at any point thought that Broncos would have made it back into the playoff picture, as you mentioned. But sure enough, they did. And that's a good thing in the sense that it built up some players' confidence, kind of like got things moving in the right direction, got the snowball rolling the right way. But it was also the bad thing in terms of, well, now you're not at the top of the draft anymore. Now you can't take advantage of this quarterback loaded draft that's coming up. There's some interesting guys that might fall. Like I've heard Penix's name kind of like fall a little bit in most mock drafts. So maybe the Broncos could still capitalize on that. If they still draft a quarterback high, I would not be surprised. But it kind of makes you think that they're probably going to have to look at some of this bridge quarterback market, some interesting names potentially out there. Like I think Ryan Tannehill, for example, is going to be like a name out there, or like, gosh, I don't know, like maybe you just sign a guy like a Sam Darnold or something like that.
Future Denver Broncos quarterback Gardner Minshew.
Gardner Minshew. Well, you think about all the backup quarterbacks that have come in this year and had success. If it's not just straight up Jarrett Stidham, then, maybe a Jake Browning who actually had success. There's like all these backup quarterbacks who came in and actually had something. Andy Dalton, I don't know. Does he go back there to be another bridge quarterback for another guy that gets drafted? Maybe. But that's kind of like what I'm looking at the Broncos' next step. For Russell Wilson, like his market, so he's obviously, like I said, the numbers are there. So he's not bad enough to drop into like backup tier. I don't see him backing up anywhere. I see him being a starter somewhere. When I think about teams out there that could use a guy like Russell Wilson, well, first off, the Broncos, who are about to cut him. But as crazy as it is, Seattle, Pittsburgh, New England, some of the names that come to mind, maybe just, fitting personality with like scheme. I don't know. Like,
the Russell Wilson experiment coming to an end. I've said this from the very beginning with the Denver Broncos. I would not have traded for Russell Wilson. I would not have given up what they gave up for Russell Wilson. However, I understand why the Broncos did what they did. They were at a situation where they didn't want to go into a rebuild. They didn't want to tear this thing to the ground after Vic Fangio got fired and they were 7-10. Even though that was the direction they probably should have gone, they wanted to try and compete, and it wasn't the right plan, but I understand why they did it in the first place. They took 2 years worth of rebuilding draft picks and young players and traded it for Russell Wilson. And I understand why they did that, even if I thought the direction their organization was at was to move into the rebuilding phase to capitalize on the quarterback classes of 2021 or maybe 2022 or 2023. I understand why they did what they did. And now at the end of this experience, maybe it's time to actually go do the rebuilding thing like they said they would. But the thing is now they actually have a not terrible team. So I don't know what the Broncos do to kind of jump from this purgatory or where they stand going into that year, because I don't know what the roster is going to look like, what they do now that they actually have draft picks back. It'll be interesting to see the direction that they go. In terms of Russell Wilson, when you threw out the names that jump to mind right away for me, the Patriots, who are probably going to still end up with a shot at a rookie quarterback. I know they're at the 3 pick right now and could fall to the 4 pick depending on how tiebreakers go between them and Washington. But the Patriots are definitely in that group. The Steelers make a lot of sense. One team you didn't mention is Atlanta. I think Atlanta would be a team that would maybe get in the Russell Wilson game because they have money to spend and they can front load the contract, get the guarantees out of the way, and similar to Derek Carr, after 2 or 3 years, you can move on from the contract and make it seem like a 4-year deal if it works out for everyone, but it's really a 2 or a 3-year contract. I think Atlanta makes a lot of sense. I think the Titans make sense. There's some teams out there, it's just figuring out where Russell Wilson wants to play at this stage of his career and what he feels the next step is going to be, because he will have suitors. He'll have teams that are willing to dish out money to a big-time quarterback. It's just figuring out the match that will work for Russell Wilson.
Yeah, when it comes to Russ, like think about those matches a little bit. So, the Seattle one is weird. Obviously, there is some tension there, but if you ask me where Russell Wilson's jersey is going to be hung in the rafters, obviously it would be in Seattle. It's like it kind of makes me feel as though like any tension, any bridges that needed to be closed, I think there's potential there. Don't sleep on it, because come on, they have Geno Smith right now, and as nice as the last 2 seasons of Geno has been, there's always been something kind of lackluster whenever they go against tougher opponents. Let's face it, every time they go against the San Francisco 49ers, Geno Smith just gets absolutely ragdolled out there. He does not look like he belongs on the field out there. That's a problem. When you look at Russell Wilson's track record against that same San Francisco 49ers, I believe as a Seahawk, he was 16-4. And hell, he's 1-0 as a Denver Bronco last year, going back to last year's game between the Broncos and Niners. It's hard to find a guy that has that kind of ownage and track record against one of your top division rivals. So maybe that's even something that they consider. And what was some of the complaints from Russell Wilson in Seattle whenever he left? Their offensive line wasn't good enough. He felt like they didn't have enough playmakers on offense and defense, respectively. Well, because of the Russell Wilson trade, now Seattle has all those things. So if you told me there was some mending of fences that happened there, I wouldn't completely downplay it. Eventually, those will be fixed because Seattle wants Russell Wilson to be a guy that comes back to town and they have fun and they hang out and they do all these special celebrations moving forward. They don't want to end completely on a sour note. The other teams that we mentioned, so New England, chaos kind of happening there right now with the coaching situation. We don't know if Bill is going to be back next year. And even if Bill Belichick was back in New England, would I see Russell Wilson and Bill Belichick getting along and playing nice? If Sean Payton couldn't play nice with Russell Wilson, then I don't see Bill Belichick and Russell Wilson being necessarily simpatico working together. Same goes with Pittsburgh, actually, too. Like at this current juncture in time, like, do I think that Kenny Pickett's done enough to like earn a surefire spot as like a starter in this league? No, based off the current numbers, but we know obviously they fired their offensive coordinator during the middle part of the year. I think if you told me that Kenny Pickett was going to at least get a third year to figure it out, I think that that's probably the most likely conclusion. And we'll see what happens too with like Mike Tomlin. We know that Pittsburgh doesn't fire coaches, but it does seem like things are starting to get a little bit weird there at this point, just given where they've been the last couple of years and given what this year has turned into. And then you mentioned Atlanta. Okay, so Atlanta, they do have the money to spend. Kyle Pitts, Drake London, Bijan Robinson, Tyler Algier, a decent offensive line to work with, and a ascending defense. If he went there, they have all the right pieces. They really do. They do have an interesting team. And if he went there, I think that they could compete because, you look at the current state of the NFC South, it's a very winnable division if they just had the right quarterback play. Unfortunately for me, that's a lot of the same things we said about Denver. And when he went to that situation, that look, he has two young ascending wide receivers, a couple playmakers, Javonte Williams. He goes to Denver, they should be able to fix everything. It's ultimately going to come down to they have the right coach. It's a shame that this relationship couldn't work, but like you said, it just seemed like a relationship that was just bound not to work. It was destined to fail. I think even if you go back to like whenever Peyton was doing like hits on the herd last year, he was even saying Russell Wilson wasn't really working out in Denver. And it's just funny. He goes there to coach and is like a year later, yeah, I can't work with this guy.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think Russell Wilson will have options, but there will be some teams that I don't think the fit will work out for both sides. Like I've heard a lot of people saying Washington, new ownership money that's coming into Washington with Josh Harris and Magic Johnson and them. The Raiders is a team that makes sense, but I don't think it like in terms of a quarterback need, but I don't think the Raiders are really going to get that game.
Like I look at the Raiders, I was going to mention them. The one thing that kind of held me back is like, They wanted to see what they had with Aiden O'Connell. Again, a guy who I don't know, did he do enough this season to really secure a job next year? They won their last game against Kansas City, but at the same time, Aiden O'Connell had like 68 passing yards in that game. So I'm like, is he good enough? Obviously, they're not sold on Jimmy. They're going to cut him too. So like the Raiders don't have a quarterback set in the future, but I think that they're more likely to maybe even make an aggressive trade for a quarterback like in this year's rookie class. Like keep an eye on the Raiders to do something like that. Heck, keep an eye on the Broncos to do something like that, given what their current draft position is.
Yeah, and you mentioned some of the teams earlier. Like I think Seattle is inclined to draft a quarterback, but not necessarily draft a quarterback with their first pick in the draft. Like Seattle has only picked one quarterback in the draft since Pete Carroll has been there, and it's been Russell Wilson. So I think they are looking at the options they have. If Penix falls to them at 22 or whatever pick they're going to have, because they'll get the 7th wild card spot and lose in the first round. Like if Penix falls to them, it might be too perfect of a match because he already plays in Seattle at the University of Washington. But if not, I think the Seahawks like wait till the second round to maybe go quarterback. Patriots, I think, are taking a quarterback at the top of the draft. That seems pretty clear at this point. So where does that leave the options on the table? Is it Pittsburgh? like we mentioned before, doesn't seem like the greatest fit in the world in terms of schematically. I mean, they don't have a scheme right now, but it doesn't seem like the greatest fit in the world for where Russell Wilson is at that stage of his career. Tennessee is a team that I'll still throw out there. I know Tennessee's going to move on from Ryan Tannehill, and they have Will Levis, and they want to see what Will Levis has in the system. But I don't want to discount the fact that if you have Russell Wilson available at your disposal, maybe you have Will Levis bridge, because Will Levis has been very good this year, but it's not so good that I wouldn't contemplate the Russell Wilson scenario. But I understand why they want to roll with Will Levis. I get it. I think Tennessee would be a great fit for Russell Wilson at this stage of his career, but I don't think Tennessee is necessarily matching up. So in that sense, maybe the suitors are kind of up in the air. I'm sure there's one or two that we're not anticipating because like they'll unexpectedly move on from a quarterback or something like that. I'm sure there will be some team that is in the quarterback market that we're not foreseeing, but those seem like the likely options for Russell Wilson.
It's funny. Usually I would like say with a guy like Russell Wilson, it would be like one of his former coordinators or former quarterback coaches that would like advocate for the guy and bring him in. But Russell Wilson and his coordinators and quarterback coaches of the past haven't really worked out. Obviously, most of them have ended up getting fired in Seattle, mostly as a result of Russell Wilson saying these guys are bogus. I mean, I guess if Shane Waldron got a head coaching job at a place that didn't have an established quarterback, maybe that might be something to keep an eye out for. Again, call me crazy. I think Seattle makes the most sense. I would just be curious, how do the fans take it if that was to happen? Would the fans be happy about that, or do you think they would embrace him with open arms? What say you, Kyle?
Well, to your point about former coordinators and quarterback coaches being in other places, there is a perfect scenario set up for him right now because one of the former Seattle quarterback coaches is now the offensive coordinator of the completely revamped Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But why would you go get Russell Wilson when you have an elite quarterback in his 20s like Baker Mayfield, who they're about to sign to a long-term extension?
I mean, Baker's been playing balls out this year. I can't take anything away from Baker.
Yeah, he's been amazing. They've had the best offense in football the last 3 weeks. It's absolutely ridiculous. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers have revived Baker Mayfield's career, and they're going to sign him to a long-term extension this offseason instead of trying to find another quarterback option. If Russ does end up back in Seattle, I don't think Seattle's entirely thrilled with him right now. And I do think, okay, so Geno Smith is popular, even if there is a ceiling on Geno Smith. But the thing that I thought was super interesting is that in Russell Wilson's last 30 games, with the Seattle Seahawks, including playoffs, Russell Wilson went 15-15. And in Geno Smith's first 30 games with the Seahawks, including playoffs, he went 15-15. So like the results have been essentially identically mid for about, 3-4 seasons now for the Seattle Seahawks. And if that's going to be your end result, like I don't think Russell Wilson is a long-term option to get you over the hump, but I don't know what is the long-term option to get Seattle over the hump. Is it drafting a quarterback who, because of Pete Carroll and that offense and having the running backs at your disposal, like is the long-term option for Seattle to draft a Michael Penix or a Bo Nix in the second round, and then that will be your developmental project that turns into a quarterback for 7 or 8 years? I don't know. Seattle had that top pick years ago from the Broncos, or I guess that was last year, and instead of going the quarterback route, they went the defense route. So I don't know where Seattle's going to go in that sense. I don't
Feels
see
like
the fit
forever
with
ago,
Russell. Huh? Yeah, it feels like a while. It's weird that Nathaniel Hackett was last year, right? Christmas Day last year was when he was giving up like 50 points to the Rams and getting fired. That seems weird.
We haven't even talked about this aspect of it, how bad that trade is in hindsight for the Broncos. I mean, you give up all these pieces, all this draft assets that the Seattle Seahawks actually parlayed into players. They actually parlayed them into actually decent players in the league. Put that against like what the Broncos have currently with this dead cap hit coming up, this no direction at quarterback. And it literally just took place over a year and a half. Like the fact that it was a year and a half of Russell Wilson for that trade, that draft capital. I mean, this has to be, I'm not going to say worst of all time, because like, I'm sure if I look back at the history of the league, there's probably 10 other trades that are worse, but it's up there. It's definitely up there.
Yeah. I think Adam Schefter put out the final details of the trade, which is now in hindsight, they got Russell Wilson and Uwazaruki, who was a 5th round pick in the deal in exchange for Drew Lock, Noah Fant, Shelby Harris, the first round pick that became Charles Cross, the second round pick that became Boye Mafe, the fifth round pick that became Tyreek Smith, the first round pick, number 5 overall, that became Devin Witherspoon, and the second round pick that became Derek Hall. That is 5 future draft picks plus Noah Fant, who I know hasn't worked out great, and they've kind of moved on. He's kind of lost his position in Seattle as a starting tight end for Colby Parkinson and guys like that, but was a former first round pick. Like, they took him in the first round and traded him within 2 years of picking him in the first round. They got 2 top 10 draft picks out of it, a starting left tackle, a starting corner, 2 edge rushers, and a quarterback who put on that backpack and won them a game to put them in the playoffs at the end of this season. Even as I think Drew Lock belongs in the XFL, Drew Lock did lead a 91-yard drive to get the Seattle Seahawks into the playoffs. So you know what? Might go down as one of the worst trades in the history of the NFL. And this is why the Denver Broncos, I'm getting real close to saying it, but I know they have Sean Payton. It has been a decade of irrelevance for the Denver Broncos now. This will be their 8th consecutive season missing the playoffs. We have watched in real time as they have gone from being the team that was winning the Super Bowls with the best defense in the league to Patrick Mahomes and Andy Reid taking that division from them in the same way that the Dolphins of Dan Marino totally disappeared once the New England Patriots came into the picture, and the Dolphins still haven't won a playoff game since Y2K. Since 2000 was the last time the Dolphins won a playoff game. We saw in real time the Broncos go from the no-fly zone defense that carried them to a Super Bowl to becoming completely irrelevant in the landscape of the NFL over the last decade. And at the end of this entire run, we're getting real close to welcoming the Denver Broncos to a second decade of irrelevance within the NFL landscape.
All right, guys. Well, what do you make of the Russell Wilson decision to put him on the bench to ride the pine? I'd like to hear your thoughts in the comment section. Leave a like on the video, subscribe to the channel, follow us on all our social medias. From Juju and Kyle, stay safe, happy, and healthy. We'll see you next time.